Good afternoon and welcome to the fourth and final installment of our Congressional Climate Camp Briefing Series. I'm Dan Brissett. I'm the president of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. And today our topic is the process and path forward for a bipartisan surface transportation bill. Big thanks right off the bat to Representative Paul Tonko and his great staff for helping us arrange to have this room today. EESI was founded by a bipartisan group of members of Congress, and since 1984, we have provided science-based information about environmental, clean energy, and climate change topics for policymakers and the public. We do our best to ensure that all of our resources are always timely, relevant, accessible, and practical. We put a lot of thought into how our resources can be ready before congressional staff even know they need them. Congressional Climate Camp is one way we help staff get started on the right foot at the beginning of a new Congress. Our first briefing was an interactive look into climate modeling, the drivers of climate change, and the benefits of mitigation measures available to us already. Then we convened an expert panel to teach us about the budget, appropriations, and reconciliation processes. And most recently, we hosted a briefing that examined how onshoring clean energy boosts American competitiveness, and that discussion took us on a great tour of manufacturing facilities in Texas and across the country. I encourage you all to go back and rewatch any of the climate camps you missed. They're all available online at www.eesi.org. You can also download presentation materials, and eventually you'll also be able to read summary notes. In addition to Congressional Climate Camp, we have a ton of other great resources in the works. Of special note is our April 1st briefing with the Business Council for Sustainable Energy and Bloomberg NEF about the latest edition of the Sustainable Energy in America Factbook. That is a really great resource if you're trying to get a landscape view of the energy system in the United States. The Sustainable Energy in America Factbook is a great resource. And so I'd definitely check that out if you're interested. There are information about briefings, upcoming briefings on the sign-in table, as well as slides that our presenters will share in just a moment. So don't hesitate and RSVP right away. As always, the best way to keep up with everything we do is to subscribe to our bi-weekly newsletter, Climate Change Solutions. But today we're talking about the Surface Transportation Bill, or AKA the Highway Bill. A legislative effort this big, with so many far-reaching impacts across American society, will almost certainly be one of those big legislative items that almost everyone on the Hill works on one way or the other while it's being considered. And what's at stake? Well, not just greenhouse gas emissions, although that's a big part of it. The transportation sector accounts for about a third of that. But it also just making life better for more people by providing accessible options to get around, by reducing congestion, and by clearing up the air and the water. Is a climate-smart transportation policy a good thing? Sure, of course it is. But the operative word here is smart. Consider how you get around in your own lives. And now think about what you would like that vision to be in the future. I bet you would like to have transportation options that are more convenient, that are faster, and that are more flexible. And you know what? As we'll hear today, faster, more convenient, and more flexible can also be more sustainable. We'll have a question and answer period at the end of our panel today. We'll take questions from in the room. We have a microphone that'll come around. And we also have a large online audience today, and we'll take questions from you as well. If you're in our online audience and you have a question, you can get it to us by sending us an email, and the email address to use is ask, that's ASK, at eesi.org. Also, be sure to follow us at EESI Online on social media. We'll be doing real-time coverage on our Instagram story and also Blue Sky. And lastly, feedback. We do our best to ensure that our resources are as good as possible. We have a survey link here, a QR code. If you have a moment now, or we'll also put this back up at the end of the presentations, at the end of the briefing today. But if you have a few moments to let us know what you think, to share your feedback, we'd really appreciate that. We read every response, and we've actually added some new questions. So if you skipped the survey lately thinking you're not missing anything, well, you're actually kind of missing something. So we'd really appreciate that. So without further ado, let us get to our really awesome panel. Our first speaker today is Benito Pérez. He is the Policy Director for Transportation for America. He previously served in various roles at the District of Columbia Department of Transportation, focused on curbside management and operations and transportation policy. Before DDOT, he was a transportation engineer with the Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization in Virginia, working on long-range transportation planning and its intersection with active transportation and land use. Additionally, he worked with the Maryland State Highway Administration, working on equity and inclusion issues in transportation. I've seen Benito give this presentation before. You are all really in for it. It's fantastic. Benito, I'll invite you to bring your name tent up to the lectern, and I'll turn it over to you. Thanks so much for being here. Good afternoon.
and to our virtual audience as well. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Benito Pérez. I am the, again, Policy Director of Transportation for America. And we're part of Smart Growth America, which is a national nonprofit organization that has their North Star focus on the principle of doesn't matter who you are, where you live, you should be able to live in a community that's healthy, prosperous, and resilient. And we do that through our three-pronged impact model of technical assistance, advocacy, and thought leadership. And then zooming in within Transportation for America, we have three core principles that guides our work: safety over speed, the state of repair of our transportation system, and investing in the rest of our transportation system. But, and I'm going to be level setting surface transportation reauthorization, and we're thinking about all of surface transportation, not just highways. But before we start, I want to start with this fundamental question that I start with every presentation, is who are we doing the transportation system for? Is it for vehicles or for people? And when we think about people, we don't want to think of them as a monolithic idea. There's people aging in place, there's children playing on the streets, people with disabilities that want to be living independently, and those historically been marginalized from mobility opportunities. And those people belong to a diversity of communities, and no two communities are alike. I'm sure there's folks in the room that would love to live in New York. I'm not one of them. There's others that will, that are from Montpelier, Vermont, Wheeling, West Virginia, Oxford, Mississippi, Aspen, Colorado, among others. They all are unique based on the community as well as the people that live within it. However, common across all those communities is the ongoing transportation challenges that we're facing. We have a roadway safety crisis. Compared to the rest of the world, if you take the United States out of the picture, statistically, the rest of the world is getting safer on our roadways. You add the United States in, the whole world's getting unsafe on our roadways. That's the magnitude of the roadway safety crisis here in the United States. We're actually doing worse than places like Serbia, Costa Rica, Colombia. We're not comparing ourselves with the rest of the EU or our neighbors to the north or south. We're further below that. Then we also have the issue of lack of mobility choices. Because of past transportation and land use decisions, some people don't have the opportunity to move about. The person on the bottom right is actually a relative of mine. She just turned 105 in early February in southern Puerto Rico. And she has to rely on relatives that come from San Juan every other weekend to take her to the grocery store, because the nearest grocery store is a 20-minute drive away. She has no ability to walk in her neighborhood. She still can walk, but there's limited sidewalks and the destinations aren't near her. Then there's the issue of accessibility, and not only thinking about access to those community services, but also just being able to travel the network, especially if you have a disability. Our system is not set up to be accessible for all users. And lastly, we have the issue of climate change impact on our transportation system. Folks from North Carolina may have experienced the flooding from Hurricane Helene, and how some roadways were washed away, bridges washed away, and communities cut off. In California with the wildfires, again, some communities were cut off, earthquakes, etc. We can go on, but these are some of the ongoing transportation challenges that our communities are facing. Doesn't matter what kind of community you are. Digging a little deeper, like, how did we get here? Well, some of the challenge has to do with the fact of, to that first question, who are we doing this for? When they were thinking about people, they're thinking about the 9-to-5 downtown work commuter. And if in your daily life, you might go out for nightlife. There's the third shift people that are cleaning our offices. There's a whole diversity of people working, living, playing, and it does not conform to the 9-to-5 downtown work trip. But that's how a lot of our communities in this country are set up. So it leaves a lot of people with limited access to mobility opportunities in their community. Now I'm going to do a history lesson. If take a step back, and this is Seattle, Washington, in the early part of the 20th century. Prior to the 1930s, transportation was a local matter. The states and the localities were the ones making the investments. And in Seattle, they made an investment towards sidewalks. But each community was treating the transportation system differently. There was different, expectations. There was no consistency. But that was the first time the federal government jumped in and started investing in our transportation system in the 1930s. And it's exclusively on national system of roads, which today we take for granted the system that we live in. But digging a little deeper, I want to highlight two key points in history when it comes to surface transportation. I'm sure folks on the might know the person on the left, at least the core person in there is President Dwight Eisenhower. He's the one responsible for the most significant highway transportation investment in 1956, the National Highway Defense Bill in 1956, and that's what led to the highways that we see today. The problem with that, though, was he was basing that from his experience in Europe when he was in World War II, seeing how the various communities in Germany were well connected between them, and he wanted to bring that to the United States. The problem was some practitioners and decision makers took it a step too far. They were thinking about, how do I connect this one neighborhood to the other within with highway approaches just within a community, which might be a little too much. Then the person on the right, some may know him, some may not, but that's Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He's responsible for what I would consider the modern Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill, ICE-T, and that was in 1991. Him and his staff, wrote that bill, and that's what framed it as a multimodal surface transportation bill. Because between 1956 and 1991, transit was also a local matter. President Lyndon Johnson brought in, advocated for a bill in the 60s. We eventually got the mass transit program set up. 1980s, we started to get more consistent funding for it. And then it was fully integrated by Senator Moynihan in 1991. So I'm going to get into reauthorization. In short, that is the process that you all are about to embark on, you and your bosses are about to embark on when it comes to reauthorizing the investments and the policy framework for our federal surface transportation program. Since 1991, we've had at least 6 reauthorizations. The most recent one that you probably hear a lot about is IJA, or BILL, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. But I want to highlight the fact that since 1991, we have spent a cumulative $1.5 trillion in surface transportation. 1.5. And on top of that, I also want to manage expectations there, and I hope you pull it off, but there's historical precedent. You're going to need an extension to spend some time to nitpick on some policy issues, but also funding issues. So do expect some extension time necessary to hash out those details. We're here on Capitol Hill, and just for those that don't already know, there's various authorizing committees that are responsible for the bill. Here, we're on the House side. As you know, the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee is responsible for all of it. And then the Ways and Means Committee deals with how to pay for it. Senate side, not so simple. That one's broken up into 4 different committees. Finance will deal with the funding situation, but then Commerce will deal with safety, rail, and freight. Banking, Housing, Urban Development will deal with transit. And then Environment and Public Works will deal with our roadways. And why is it important? As I alluded to earlier, we have ongoing transportation challenges between roadway safety, lack of access, climate issues. And in 2012, MAP 21, that reauthorization, Congress set several goals for the program, which if you were to go onto U.S. Codes 23 U.S.C. 150, that's where you can find them. And if you were to, and I would encourage you to go back to your offices and ask yourselves, are we meeting the moment? Are we meeting these goals? Because what we've seen time and again with reauthorization is we have those big issues and think that nothing has been done in the past. After the infrastructure law in 2021, there were some senators that were saying, this is a climate bill. This is going to get it done. But the challenge is that they work around the edges and create new programs. As you know, or may not know, IJA created 60 new discretionary programs, but yet barely adjusted the status quo and then expected different outcomes. And yet we're still seeing the same outcomes. So all we keep doing is the graphic on the bottom right is, we try to, create new tools to put dirt back in the hole, but without shifting the status quo, the fundamental foundation of the program, we're just digging a deeper hole. And I'm going to go back to that statement that some senators were saying after IJA. They're saying, this is a climate bill. The challenge is, if we don't adjust the status quo, it's not going anywhere. There was some modeling done saying, if we truly shifted the way we invested our transportation dollars, we could see a difference. However, status quo would be similar to modeling outputs on the left, which most communities are focused on roadway expansion. You're going to yield more emission output versus it would take a fundamental shift on how we do transportation investments and implementation, so more biking, more transit, to really make a notable difference. And when you see it on the ground in your community, that could be the difference of a community with transportation infrastructure and land use that will allow you to get to destinations within 2 miles, which you could drive to it, you can bike to it, walk to it, or the difference of another community that's everything is spread out. One of the big challenges you're going to be facing is going to be funding. With the current revenue coming in the Highway Trust Fund versus how it's being spent, there's going to be a gap. And that's just, if you take everything except highways out, it's still going to be a deficit. So that's going to be a big topic of conversation for Capitol Hill. I'm going to wrap up with a couple resources for you all. If you want to dig a little deeper about the process, we did put out this guide, Reauthorization 101, to help you walk through the process. And then I alluded to those emissions outcome. We actually looked at infrastructure spending in the last couple, obligated funds, federal funds in the last couple of years, and you see a lot of red. And that has to do with the fact that a lot of the states are still spending the status quo way, so they're still leading to emissions. Yet, I'll highlight North Dakota, for example. Now the current Interior Secretary, but former Governor Doug Burgum, he made the statement we cannot continue to invest the way that we do. We don't have the people for it. We don't have the resources for it. So we need to focus on maintaining what we have. And they're starting to see those results in reducing their emissions. The other thing you'll hear in your communities is just one more lane. And yet the challenge is for the 42% increase in roadway miles and only similarly in population growth, congestion has gone through the roof. Even places like the city of Detroit, Michigan, where the population has gone down, their congestion's gone up 45%. And if you want to engage with us, this is how you can reach out. And with that, I will pass it on to my next colleague, Shruti.
Thank you, Benito. That was a great set of slides, a great presentation, and definitely encourage everyone to take a look at those resources. Also, all of the presentations that we'll go through today are available online at www.eesi.org, and of course they're printed out on the front table. So thank you very much for that. Now we will hear from our second panelist today. Shruti Vaidyanathan is the Director for Transportation Advocacy, Climate, and Energy at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Shruti has more than 15 years of experience in the transportation sector. She's committed to creating equitable, low-carbon transportation systems by advocating for policy approaches at the federal, state, and local levels that combine vehicle electrification with passenger and freight mobility solutions. Before NRDC, Shruti was the Transportation Program Director for the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. Great organization. We just had a speaker at our last clean energy briefing from ACEEE. So Shruti, you're, however, the star of the show today in our second panelist spot. So welcome to the lectern, and don't forget your name card. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really nice to be here with you. As Dan mentioned, I oversee the federal and state transportation advocacy for the Natural Resources Defense Council. And so what I'm planning to do today is just sort of give you a taste of how NRDC is going to be approaching reauthorization in the coming months as we wait for the negotiations. Let me just use So obviously NRDC is an environmental organization, so greenhouse gases are going to be the primary focus for us as we talk through reauthorization. But I think that reauthorization gives us a really nice opportunity for us to think about the broader benefits of our transportation system. And I will warn folks that you will hear a lot of similar ideas that Benito just presented to you, because T4A is one of our biggest partners in the work that we do. So our major goal here is to build on progress made with the bipartisan infrastructure law to create a transportation system that is accessible, affordable, safe, and reliable, in addition to being clean. And what I have highlighted here on this slide are just a couple of barriers or concepts around which we have organized our work at NRDC, our transportation work at NRDC, and that are particularly relevant to transportation reauthorization. So the first barrier that we've identified is there being insufficient investment and access to charging infrastructure, project delays, and processes that slow down EV charging projects. Our approach to transportation is very holistic. We see the need for investment in both EVs, but also investment in non-EV transportation. So in transit, in bike ped facilities, rideshare, et cetera, so that we're creating a holistic transportation system that serves everyone. So the work that we do around EVs is categorized under a program called Energize, where we are trying basically our best to pass laws and make investments that will deploy charging infrastructure at speed and scale across the United States using model legislation and generating funding for EV charging through big vehicles like the reauthorization bill. The second barrier that we have identified that we organize our work around is that we're seeing that states across the political spectrum are continuing to spend way too much of their transportation infrastructure funding to expand and build new highways. As Benito highlighted, expanding highways increases congestion, increases emissions, and so we would like to see that money redirected towards public transit, walkable communities, and safe bike infrastructure instead of being spent on highway expansion. So the reauthorization process really provides us a nice opportunity for impact. One of the main problems that we have identified, as I've said before, is that of the $200 billion spent on transportation infrastructure annually at the local, state, and federal scales, almost a quarter of it is going towards new roads or highway expansion. And like I said, that increases dependence on personal vehicles, reduces consumer choice, inhibits economic growth in many situations, and digs us into a much deeper transportation hole as it pertains to both greenhouse gas emissions, but also for localized pollution. So the reauthorization process is really a nice opportunity for us to sort of take that holistic approach to create transportation systems that serve all of our users. By investing in both vehicle electrification, in addition to supporting the growth of transit, bicycle, and pedestrian infrastructure, we can potentially maximize benefits. And those benefits will not only include climate impacts, but they will range from impacts from health savings, reductions in household costs, and can amount to trillions of dollars if we factor in the fact that we factor in lives saved from the transportation systems that we're building. I just want to point out this graph in the corner here, which basically shows us that our pathway to reduction for transportation emissions has to include both vehicle electrification and investment in things like transit and bike ped infrastructure. That's the only way that we'll be able to maximize the impact that we from these bills. So there are a couple of issues at stake for the next surface transportation bill that NRDC is paying particular attention to. And these are highlighted here. And my plan is to sort of work through each of these issues in the slides that are coming up. So let's move on to that. As Benito, I think, already mentioned, one of the biggest roadblocks that we are going to be seeing with the Transportation Reauthorization Bill is funding. And our main problem is that the Highway Trust Fund is insolvent at this point. As most of you know, the Highway Trust Fund is the primary source of funding for transportation. And for the last many years, the revenue from the fuel taxes that fund the Highway Trust Fund have been insufficient to cover the authorized spending amounts that are coming out of the Highway Trust Fund. Taxes haven't increased since 1993, and the previous transportation bills have relied on transfers from the general funds to the tune of about $275 billion since, I'm realizing that there's a little bit of a issue with the slide, but since 2009, there have been about $275 billion worth of transfers to keep the Highway Trust Fund solvent. And the money is now officially anticipated to run out in 2028. So we have enough in the coffers to last through fiscal year 2028. But after that, we're going to see a pretty sharp fall off in terms of revenues that we can use to fund transportation. There is a wide array of policy solutions that we can look to fill these gaps. We're starting to see proposals come out on implementing EV fees, for instance, to help fill that gap. Road user charges that people will pay according to the amount of the distance that they drive. So there's a wide array of options on the table. And one of the things that NRDC will be trying to do is make sure that whatever option we advocate for is fair in terms of the modes of transportation that it impacts, and also in terms of the populations that will end up paying paying those fees. So we want to make sure that low-income populations of color, aren't being disproportionately burdened by the fees that we are attaching to transportation use. So the next issue that we is particularly close to our heart is transit funding. Transit funding has historically focused on capital funding for transportation, for transit, not operations funding. And again, the majority of that has come from the Highway Trust Fund. The Highway Trust Fund is currently split into the highway account and then the mass transit account. And it's organized around an 80-20 split. So about 80% of the revenues into the Highway Trust Fund go towards the highway account, and the remaining 20 goes into the mass transit account. But if you look at historical data, the amount of money that's actually been spent on transit from the Highway Trust Fund has averaged about 12 to 13% over the last few years. So it hasn't gotten anywhere close to the 20% that is actually allocated. And as I said before, it covers capital expenses only. One of the things that we realized very recently as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic is that transit is essential to connecting people to their jobs, to their communities, to their resources. And we just saw how important it was to keep sort of people in the economy moving. There's been a lot of conversation about ensuring that transit is funded appropriately. And I think that continued funding from the Highway Trust Fund will be really, really important to keeping those systems safe and reliable and making sure that they're not having to contend with a sort of fiscal cliff every couple of years, and that the revenue used to sustain those systems is sustainable. Just by way of example, there is a bill that has been proposed recently to generate operations funding for transit. It's called the Stronger Communities Through Better Transit Act. And that was initiated by Congressman Hank Johnson from Georgia. And the idea there is to create an entirely separate pot of money that would actually fund transit operations rather than capital, because every transit system is only as good as the service that it provides to its people. So these are sort of the proposals that are starting to land in the run-up to the transportation reauthorization process around transit funding. The other thing that we are particularly focused on is making sure that formula and discretionary programs in the reauthorization process in the Surface Transportation Bill are maintaining continued progress towards climate goals. For all of its issues, I think both the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and IRA generated unprecedented levels of funding for transportation and created several new programs that supported a lot of things that NRDC likes. Transportation funding as part of IJA increased by 50% over the last Surface Transportation Bill. There was a wide raft of new programs around carbon, reconnecting communities that were introduced as part of the bill and that were funded through the annual appropriations process. So our priorities for the next round of negotiations will be obviously the carbon reduction program, and then reconnecting communities and thriving communities, both of which are sort of indirectly related to climate, but I think go a long way in terms of putting the decision-making around transportation in the hands of the communities that know best what they need. And we have seen we've seen huge success with both reconnecting communities and thriving communities. Both grant programs were oversubscribed. And a lot of the applicants were rural communities who felt like they needed the assistance to be able to navigate the wide array of funding programs that IIJA brought to the table. And then we also saw a fair amount of success with certain states using CRP funds to sort of reduce emissions from the transportation sector and improve access to modes of transportation. The one thing that we did find with the carbon reduction program, though, is that several states were actually transferring money out of the carbon reduction fund into highway accounts to support highway expansion and highway building. So the last sort of bullet I want to explain here is that we're super supportive of the fact that federal transportation funds can be flexed. We would love to see them flexed towards things like walking, biking, public transit, and EV charging infrastructure. States have the ability to flex funding in a variety of programs, up to 50% in particular for the National Highway Performance Program, Surface Transportation Program, and CMAQ, and obviously the Carbon Reduction Program. When money is flexed out of these accounts, it just means that those states are deprioritizing climate and the investments that we would like to see in the way that they're building their transportation systems. And so we would prefer that money actually goes towards the things that we've highlighted here. In general, our belief is that infrastructure investments can sort of help or hinder the transition to clean transportation systems. So if we get to a situation where it's actually helping, we can reduce household costs and improve sort of connections to economic centers and key services. So this is just a few of the principles that we are keeping in mind as we start to, as we embark on our surface transportation reauthorization work. We want to make sure that in order to achieve the goal that I highlighted in this presentation, that we're sort of baking safety, climate, and accessibility across all the programs. We're not necessarily carving out like a climate program. We'd love to be able to see greenhouse gases reduction sort of scattered throughout the bill. Like Benito flagged for T4A, we want to put people before pavement when we're deciding on funding. We need to create transportation systems for people rather than vehicles. And we also want to see some real shifts in funding, some real tangible shifts in the way that we fund transportation, and also to reward states that are actually doing the work to invest in clean transportation. And that is all I have for you. If you have any questions, happy to answer them during the Q&A, and of course, feel free to reach out if there's anything specific I can answer.
Thank you. While you're making your way back, I'll give you this back. Thank you. I don't want to take credit. While you're making your way back, just a quick question. You mentioned the 80-20 split. Is that a fixed split, or is that variable, and could that split change, or is it just fixed at 80-20?
Benito might be better at answering this question, but in general, the 80-20 split sort of came about. The 80-20 split sort of came about by default and hasn't been changed in recent years. And I think one of the questions on the table is, would it be possible to actually change that split when it comes to the way the Highway Trust Fund is spent?
Interesting.
So the quick history on that 1982 reauthorization bill. I know it was Senator Lautenberg and I forgot his Republican counterpart, but they struck a deal and set the 80-20 split as the floor. They said, let's just start here, see how things go, and then let's modify this from here, knowing that there's going to be more investments needed in public transportation. However, the challenge is recent reauthorization has been treated as the ceiling, and some of it has to do with you all as staff on the Hill, the turnover. There's about 600 of you all supporting the members and the committees, the authorizing committees. And what you may not know and I don't know what the number is now, but at the end of the 118th Congress, of the 600 that were there for IJA, only 15 of you were still working on staff. So the institutional knowledge evaporated. So that knowledge about that this was just the floor, not the ceiling, disappeared, especially after all these years. So it's been treated as like that's how it's always been. And hopefully, through the crux of this question is, we should be asking the question, why is it? And should we be thinking about it differently?
Great, thanks. Yeah, great example. Exactly why we do Congressional Climate Camp. We realize that things are always changing up here, and that's okay. We are now going to hear from a speaker with a state perspective, and a local perspective. But I'd like to welcome Senator Jennifer Boysko to the lectern. Jennifer represents the 38th District in the Virginia State Senate, which includes parts of Fairfax County. She was first elected to the Senate in 2019 and previously served as a member of the Virginia House of Delegates from 2015 to 2019. In her role as chair of Virginia's Transportation Committee, Senator Boysko helped secure funding to modernize the state's transportation infrastructure, repair roads and bridges, and make historic investments in passenger rail. Jennifer, thank you so much for taking your time to join us today. Really looking forward to your presentation. I think you're all set. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to the Environmental and Energy Study Institute for hosting us today. As you heard, I've served 10 years in the Virginia General Assembly and have focused much of my time on transportation policy and funding during my tenure. I served over the past 2 years as the chair of the Transportation Committee. I also serve on several transportation funding and planning boards that meet throughout the year, including the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority and the Transportation Planning Board of the Metropolitan Council of Governments, which is a multi-state body. Virginia, for those of you who are not from my home state, is a home to 8.8 million people. Our transportation system has 128,000 miles of road and more than 11,900 bridges. We have a world-class metro system, 2 of the most major airports in the country, Dulles and Reagan National, and one of the largest ports in the Eastern Seaboard. So we have a pretty complicated transportation system. And today I'm going to go over the federal transportation funding that Virginia specifically has received and leveraged with other funding sources to make our critical infrastructure improvements. This would not be possible without the support of our congressional delegation, and want to thank you all who all work on this every single day for the efforts that you've made. It makes a big impact, and I hope that you can see how it's benefited the Commonwealth of Virginia and the people who visit. So the slides are going to go into more detail about the projects that I'm going to discuss, but I'm not going to go line by line for each project. Happy to make the presentation available to you all. So we know that, the long-term funding cycle that Virginia has that allows our state to plan for big infrastructure projects and investments, because we don't have the capacity to fully fund them. We rely on the federal government to assist us. And you can see on my slide here that 17.4% of our funding comes from the federal government. A lot of the money that we get is incremental steps and requires only one-time funding for planning or engineering process. And when we partner with the federal government, that's the only way we have the capacity to invest in these critical projects. So we have, through the IJA, we have benefited from the PROTECT, the RAISE, the Connecting Community, and the NEVI grants. We also enjoy public-private partnerships in the Commonwealth, and all of these have made significant impacts for us. Transportation funding is a huge challenge for us. And so what I have attempted to do here is so you can see that it is quite a pie chart of different ways that we cobble different funding sources together. We have more needs than we have money for, but you can see how it is all generated. In fiscal year 2024, our budget for the Virginia Department of Transportation identified estimated revenues and the distribution of revenues to the related transportation programs. It's based on the state's revenue forecasts from December 22nd, 2022, and reflects implementation of the IJA. The budget for fiscal 2024 for transportation for a VDOT only was $8,669,574,775. So it's a pretty big chunk of change. The first priority for our funding is maintaining our existing infrastructure, and this comes primarily from the financial plan's highway maintenance and operating funds. You can see here examples of our highway improvements that benefited from the federal funds provided by IJA, and you'll see that the funding was allocated all throughout the Commonwealth, from the most rural regions of Southwest Virginia to urban Nova, Northern Virginia, Richmond, and the Hampton Roads regions. And so I've just listed here just a handful with the amounts of money that each of the some of the locations received. For the VDOT budget, after maintenance and other programs that are needed or funded, the remaining construction and funding is distributed according to our own Virginia funding formula. And the Virginia Commonwealth Transportation Board allocates the funding through these core programs based on objective and transparent projected selection processes. So we are not just taking the funds that we receive from the federal government and just throwing them. We are using really data-driven metrics to make decisions for the Commonwealth and using that money for best needs, including our bridges, which we have thousands of that are some are very, very old. You've already heard us talk a little bit about connecting community grants, and I have two examples of connecting community grants that we have enjoyed here in Virginia, in Norfolk and in Richmond. In Norfolk, we had a reconnecting community project that planned for a solution to what they call the Spaghetti Bowl. And that is a 14-lane wide jumble of ramps and interchanges that cut off a low-income, primarily African-American neighborhood from access and connectivity to the downtown area. The plan is going to be implemented with community input so that people can get from one side of town to the other without having to somehow try to get across a massive transportation system. The next one that I wanted to highlight is in the city of Richmond. Jackson Ward is one of the historic African-American communities in Virginia. And originally in the 1950s, when they put I-95, which is a major highway, and I-64, it completely split this community so that they really couldn't get from one side to the other. So these connecting community grants are actually going to continue to help rebuild the community as it once used to stand, and it's very important to those residents. We've also talked a lot about multimodal transportation. This is not just a highway. We do not just use highway funding. It is imperative because there is no one-size-fits-all for our transportation investments. For instance, in Northern Virginia, where I live, about an hour from here, you might use the Metro Rail. You might use our commuter rail, which is called the VRE. You might use a bus. You might drive for part of that way, take a bike, or walk to get around, depending on where you live, what time you're going, where you're going, and the day of the week. And so not only are our multimodal transportation projects in Northern Virginia, but really they're all throughout the whole Commonwealth. And these are some more examples that you can see throughout the Commonwealth. And again, these are Democratic and Republican communities, rural and urban and suburban. All of Virginia is really benefiting from this funding. Multimodal transportations are essential to reduce congestion and support our economic vitality and quality of life. Another benefit, not just getting people from point A to point B, but being able to get them to their jobs and get people to school and to church. One of the things that we are really investing in Virginia has been bus rapid transit, and it is a fast, frequent, and reliable system of being able to get folks places, and it is more easily funded and implemented than, say, a metro would be. And then, as we have heard also, funding for pedestrian and bicycle safety. Our Virginia Highway Safety Improvement Program is guided through this Strategic Highway Safety Plan to implement safety improvements across our roadways. The VHSIP requires data-driven strategic approaches to improving highway safety on all public roads, and that is to make sure that we are making our communities more safe. One of the really pieces that I'd like to point out is in Richmond. We've identified that about 40% of the most serious incidences where people are killed or injured occurs on only 3% of the roadway networks in Richmond. And so this federal funding that we've received from you all has been secured to make improvements to increase pedestrian safety in just 26 projects, about $10 million for that. Another another big transportation piece is on our actual railway. And if you've ever taken a train on the Eastern Seaboard, you are affected by what we have, the Long Bridge, which goes from DC to Virginia. It is a CSXT-owned two-track central bridge that connects the two. And because of the federal funding that we have received from different pots of money in Virginia, we will be able to create a 4-track corridor that's only approximately 1.8 miles of improvement, but it will include 7 rail bridges, pedestrian bridges over land in the Potomac River. There will be a new bike and pedestrian bridge that will be constructed as part of it. And this will make it so that trains don't have to stop and wait for the freights. It will allow constant passage through this what has been a bottleneck in our Amtrak and CSXT rail system. And so that was the picture of there I got behind. Then as we are looking at decarbonization and greenhouse gas emissions, I happen to have asthma. We see incidences of lung challenges rising every year. So it is important that we decarbonize our transportation system. We know that is the biggest component to greenhouse gases. And so we have embraced a wide variety of transportation modes and received funding from a variety of different sources that we've received from the federal government. Virginia recognizes that establishing our rail infrastructure provides a key mode for DC-centric travel. Our resiliency programs, such as Protect, help fund these improvements, and our express lanes that are funded by public-private partnerships also provide high-quality network for efficient and reliable travel at no cost for vehicles that have 3 or more occupants, and that includes our commuter buses, who are able to ride for free on those. These approaches, and along with our BRT system that we're working to build, are opportunities to reduce greenhouse emissions. But also, we know that with our long-term transportation funding, that we've got to do more. And so we, have started investing in our electric buses and incorporated charging stations within our bus storage and maintenance facilities, as well as charging stations infrastructure along our major highways with the assistance of this federal funding. So I just want to thank you again for your time and interest in seeing exactly how federal dollars help a specific state. I want to give special thanks to our senators, Senator Warner and Kane, as well as all of our members of the Virginia delegation, Senators Conley, Beyer, Subramaniam, Delegate Scott, and Congressman Scott and Congresswoman McClellan. Thank you to our friends at EESI for hosting this today, and my contact information is listed if you do have questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you. We'll pass this back down to you. You mentioned ports and airports, but also Benito included in his slide a photo of Eisenhower, right? And a lot of this was driven by a national security imperative and tremendously important military installations. And one thing we covered in a briefing about a year ago is that it's just to talk a little bit about how much the military installations rely on the surrounding communities, whether it's the electric grid or the schools and other sort of commercial area. These really are things that are part of their community, and the Pentagon, for example, a pretty big one.
National security.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Being able to get around, but also do so in a resilient way. That's great. Thank you so much. We have heard from 3 tremendous panelists. We still have one more. I bet you all have questions. If you do, we will take questions from the room. If you're in our online audience today, thank you for that. Oh, we're going to do it at the end of the thing, but noted. If you're in our online audience, you can also ask us questions, and you can send us an email with your question, and the email address to use is ask, that's ask@eesi.org. So, without further ado, let me introduce Amber Dallman. Amber is the Director of Sustainability and Public Health at the Minnesota Department of Transportation. Thanks for coming out from Minnesota. Amber has a Master's of Public Health from the University of Minnesota and also 20 years of experience working at the intersection of public health and sustainable travel options with communities throughout Minnesota, including work with the Minnesota Department of Health in Ramsey County. Amber, thank you so much for joining us today. I will queue up your slides. Really looking forward to your presentation.
Hello. Thank you all for having me and being here this afternoon. So it's been great to hear the overview of how some of this all comes together, and then also from Virginia and what this looks like in one state. So I'm going to share a little bit about what this looks like for Minnesota and how we've been able to use some of the funds specifically for around sustainability for IIJA, or the Investment Infrastructure Jobs Act. So just a little bit of context. Our vision for the transportation system is that we have a system that maximizes the health of people, the environment, and the economy. And this slide gives an overview of what the transportation system in Minnesota covers at the DOT. We have the 4th largest public road system in the nation, where we have just under 12,000 center miles of interstate U.S. and Minnesota highways. You can see that we serve all 87 counties throughout the state with transit. We also have many things related to our roads and bridges. And the next slide that I'm going to share with you gives a little more context on where all of these investments go and what it looks like in our nearly $4 billion agency budget annually. So this slide, you can disregard the small text on it, but what it really helps us understand is what our 20-year state highway investment plan direction is. We have 6 investment categories that we look to have established targets within, and the funding amounts here are those investment targets over the course of 20 years. So primarily that big, large green portion is system stewardship, and it includes basically our maintenance and operations of our roads and bridges. So not surprising, and I think this kind of fits into some of the things that we heard from T4A, but much of NRDC, that much of the investments that we make throughout the state in our transportation system is related to roads and bridges. Then you can see that there's a light blue, purple, and a little orange color here, and then on the bottom right, a little bit of a reddish color. That's about 15% of our investment targets, and those investment directions include critical connections, which is where we also look at providing travel options and choices for people throughout the state. The purple portion is looking at our healthy communities, and that's where we'll see some of our local partnership work, as well as some of our main streets and urban reconstruction projects. The orange part is safety, and then the reddish brown part is our climate resilience. So I think that the key thing here is that we're really looking oftentimes, especially with some of these new programs, about how we can make sound investments in our program and our project delivery that serve people throughout the state of Minnesota. And what I'll share with you next is what we're hearing from people and as it relates to some of our sustainability goals. So while I mentioned the investment direction, those categories that are up there are based on our long-range plan, which is what we refer to as our statewide multimodal transportation plan. Many state DOTs have their own plan that sets their own goals and targets and strategies that they're looking to achieve. In Minnesota, we have goals and targets around climate action, critical connections, resilience, and some of the things that we hear in our planning process is that people throughout the state really want safe, convenient, and affordable travel options. And this is in our very rural parts of the state, as well as our very more urban and regional centers. And that includes places like walking and biking. So, for example, you can see a recent reconstruction project listed in the image here, which really shows that people do want to be able to walk and bike in their small towns. This is about a town of just under 5,000. And as many people who may or not be familiar with the Midwest, walking or biking to ice cream, especially in the warmer months, is pretty key to be able to do, as well as local grocery stores. But this project also highlights the sustainable and resilient infrastructure that people throughout the state have been asking for, which we also hear from folks throughout the state, that people want infrastructure that's going to withstand some of the changing weather patterns that we have. So when we have variation in freeze thaw, which we've had a decent amount of, like we had 1 week this past winter with negative double temps, and the next week 50 degree swing, which has a real impact on the infrastructure and in the transportation system that we have statewide. So they want infrastructure that's going to withstand those changes, including some of the flooding that we see, as well as wildfires that have been hitting our state, as well as other states throughout the country. And what this results in is that people really want to see connected networks, even where we have smaller communities with our state highways traveling through them. They want to be able to have convenient, reliable travel options and choices throughout the state to help meet their daily needs. And we do, just the other thing to keep in mind, as a state, we have statutory goals related to this. So we have goals related to greenhouse gas emissions. We have goals related to vehicle miles traveled, but what this results in terms of infrastructure and what people are asking for are affordable, reliable options to be able to have choice in how they get around in their destinations. So when it comes to the bipartisan infrastructure law, some of the things that I'm going to share related to how this worked and what it looked like in Minnesota, and this is going to focus on the carbon reduction program, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, and PROTECT, which is the resilience-related program in our state. Some of the challenges that we had and some of the ways that what we were able to do with it. So first of all, anytime there's like a new law that states are asked to implement and administer, it takes a little bit of time. So this law was passed in November of 2021 in our state. We had to seek approval for some of the new programs to even begin work on those programs. And that delayed our work about 1.5 years in terms of what we were able to actually start with. So I can understand and see where there might be a little bit of, there may be questions about where is this money going or why is it taking so long. Each state is set up differently in terms of the process that it has to approve and administer the use of some of the federal funds. And in Minnesota, that delayed us in terms of how we were able to get things going. What it was helpful, and Shruti touched on this, is that there's flexibility in those programs. So we were able to be flexible in how we thought about the funding in those early years, and then also how we were able to use funds from other formula program funds in our state DOT to help us with protect resilient related projects as well as carbon reduction. Some of the big things that we did with the early parts of these particular formula programs was we did some planning, and many states did planning, and a lot of this planning built on some of the long-range work we already had. So we had our long-range plan that identified these particular areas, but it didn't get into a lot of detail in terms of the actual strategies and activities. So with the carbon reduction strategy, for example, we heard from people that they really wanted us to focus those investments around travel options, which is looking at walking, biking, and transit and making sure that we're making investments statewide related to that. They also wanted us to look at electrification and low carbon fuels. So what are some things that we could do to decrease the fuel sources and electrify the system throughout the state? And then there was a third category related to our overall transportation infrastructure operations and system management. So there's some things within those plans and strategies that are helping us look at how we can integrate this work on an ongoing basis. So when you look at the overall budget, some of the things that we're thinking about as a state DOT and a team is how do we continue to sustain this work over time, and how do we integrate it into our general program, our program overall, so it's not just a standalone formula program, and how do we make sure that it's addressing the needs that we see from communities. So we were able to engage people throughout the state on those plans. So that includes our resilience improvement plan, as well as some of the electrification plan that we're working on, and where there are needs statewide to implement. And then we are also looking at how we can implement some of that work. So the next examples that I have are just a few of what this looks like on the ground, some of the things that we see statewide. This first example is from a town in southeast Minnesota, where what you can see is that it's, again, it kind of goes back to what people want to be able to have travel options. They want to be able to safely get across the street to destinations in their community. And I think many people may be familiar that when you get to smaller towns, and especially in some of our rural parts of the state, the grocery stores are fewer and far between. And so on the bottom right picture there, you can see we have a Casey's, which is a local gas station convenience store, but it's also a place that serves as a grocery store often for people throughout the state. And you can see that marked crosswalk is directly taking people to that convenience store. And that's something that we heard from community members in terms of a need to make sure that people were able to walk and bike or get to that convenience store, as well as to get into town. So another example that we have is in the northeastern part of the state. This is Bowabic, Minnesota, and you can see similar things again. You can also see that people are asking for things related to making sure they have resilient infrastructure and green infrastructure, that helps when we may have extreme weather events. And you can also see that, again, in this particular example and location, that there are key destinations that people are asking for. So in the bottom right, you can see that little sign there is actually a grocery store. And so people are wanting to make sure that they can get to the city hall and grocery store that's right off to the right there. And they want to be able to have access where they have options for getting there in a safe and convenient, reliable way. These particular examples continue to reinforce what we're hearing from people statewide in terms of ways that they want to travel. The next two are planned projects that we have from our carbon reduction program as well as from our resilience program and Protect. This one is in the southwestern part of our state, and this gets into some examples of what we heard and are able to apply some of our carbon reduction program funds for. This Marshall is a town, it's a regional center, it's a town of about 10,000 people. And some of the things that people identified in this process is that they wanted to be able to move safely across town, and they wanted to be able to have options for how they were able to get across town. And that means that this project in particular includes things like roundabouts, which increase how the flow of traffic and slows people driving down, as well as walking and bicycling improvements. It also includes things like landscaping and lighting. And because this is a regional center and agriculture is a big employer in this part of the state, it also considered freight movements throughout this area in this particular project area. And then the last example I have for you is from the southeastern part of our state. And this is Winona. And this, I think, also gives an example of some of the things that we're seeing related to resilience and creating more resilient transportation infrastructure. So this is a project in particular that's looking at restoring the slope and stabilizing slopes through in this project area. Some of the things that we're intending to see as a result of this project are improved drainage, shoulder widening, as well as replacing guardrail. It's a pretty hilly part of the state, so there are bluffs within this particular region, and so the roadway can be narrow in portions. So that's the last example I have to share. I am going to actually talk a little bit about this last picture because I think it does get into the intersection of resilience and climate. This is an image near Interstate 94 in the west central part of our state, and this is showing a solar snow fence. And the snow fence in particular helps with blowing snow along the interstate system, and it has helped to reduce the number of runs that we need from some of our snowplow operators in this particular part of the state. So it's reducing the need for maintenance overall, and it's also an agreement that we've been able to put renewable energy within our right of way. So I think we're now moving to the question and answer part.
I'm from Vermont originally, and we have there's an old timer Vermont joke where someone visiting the state says how do you get from here to there, and they say, well, you can't get there from here. And I imagine there's something like that in Minnesota. I feel like Vermont and Minnesota have enough in common there. But it's so frustrating when you're like, I can't cross the street because it's too big, and there's no place to cross. I was driving the other night, and there were people trying to cross the road in the middle of this really long stretch. It was 3 lanes, on each side, and it's of course they're trying to cross the road because otherwise they have to walk 2 miles to a crosswalk, and on each side of the road is stores, and it drives me crazy. So it'd be great to see that taken care of at the planning stage and not, having to deal with that on a daily basis. So as Amber said, it is indeed time for questions and answers. We're going to take questions from our online audience, and some really good ones have already started coming in, so thank you for that. It's not too late. We have 25 minutes or so, and you can send us an email, and the email address to use is ask, that's ask@eesi.org. But to get us started, we're talking about the surface transportation bill. And like I said in my intro, a lot of people will work on this at a lot of different times. But I also kind of have the hunch that a lot of people who maybe don't work on transportation per se on a daily basis will have something to do with it. And so, Benito, maybe we could start with you and then go down through the line. But for congressional staff who don't work directly on transportation issues, why is it important, and why can it be beneficial to them and their bosses to be paying attention to this bill now, even if maybe it's not part of their normal portfolio?
Sure. So it might not be, I know you all have a lot on your plates. You all have different portfolios that you handle. And that might not be the biggest thing on your boss's list, but transportation impacts everyone from the moment you walk out the door every morning to when you go on vacation to where you work right here in Washington, D.C. And it impacts you at every stage of your life from the moment, you're a toddler to, the 105-year-old relative that I showed you earlier. And as Shruti and I already mentioned earlier, resources are getting more limited, especially for the next reauthorization. So we're going to have to make some tough choices. And that's something that, the committee will spend some time, laying the groundwork, but it's going to involve everybody having to make some decisions. And, with those resources limited, we need to maximize our outcomes. Past approach, we worked around the edges and expect different outcomes, and yet we keep getting the same results. And why it should matter at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're, on the committees or not, is, as a practitioner, I'm sure the state senator or my colleague from Minnesota would agree, like when you're on the ground, and if you're like a mayor or a council member, the first thing, the public's going to yell at you is probably about that transportation or that public works issue. There's that congestion, or my kids can't get there safely to school because they got hit by a car. But then when you dig a little deeper, you may realize that some of their hands are tied because we talked about. I had a graphic about state flexibility. So that is some of the conversation you'll hear here in Capitol Hill. But once you get on the ground to like the state level, what you think is state flexibility, there's still a lot of federal roadblocks to that true flexibility to what the state's trying to accomplish. So in some situations, their hands are tied. And the last thing I'll say, most folks that they're dealing with these issues are the engineers and planners. Specifically, the engineers are trained to solve problems. But if the policy statement coming from Washington, from you all, is the car movement efficiency, then that's what you're going to get. And yet, what you may not realize is 30% of Americans don't or can't drive. So we need to rethink, going back to the question I asked at the very beginning, who are we doing this for? And this should apply to everyone. It doesn't matter if you're on the authorizing committees or not.
Great, thank you. Shruti, let's go to you next. Why should staff who don't work on transportation issues, why should they be paying attention to this process, and how can they constructively engage?
Yeah, so two things come to mind. The first is that transportation is the second largest cost for American households. Based on research that I did at ACEEE, if you're looking just at transportation fuels, your average household is paying anywhere from 7% to 10% of its budget on gasoline or diesel. And if you start adding in things like vehicle maintenance and insurance, it bumps up to even significantly higher. So at the end of the day, at a time when things are just getting more expensive, paying attention to funding for transportation and making sure that people have access to affordable transportation, I think is something that everyone should pay attention to because like Benito said, transportation impacts everyone. The second point I want to make is that transportation policy can't be made in a vacuum. I think for NRDC in particular, making sure that we have usable, accessible, functional transportation systems for everyone will include engaging with housing advocates, engaging with land use advocates, land use decision making. Those things sort of come together to make sure that we are creating the transportation systems that we want to see in the future. And so all the more reason, I think, for all of you who are juggling like a variety of different things to sort of pay even a passing eye to the negotiations that are going to be happening for the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill.
What do you mean, lots of things? There's nothing happening.
Nothing happening.
No,
yeah.
nothing at all.
Nothing happening at all.
Yeah, just blank newspapers delivered every day. Jennifer, over to you. From your perspective as the person who has to make these kinds of decisions at the state level or influence these decisions at the state level, what would you say to members of your delegation about why they should be looking at this, even if maybe it's not top of mind for them?
Absolutely. So I think that they probably do understand this is your home cooking, right? Like this is what your constituents care about on a daily basis. Some of the stuff that Congress deals with will never affect, the folks sitting at their kitchen table, but this absolutely will. And as we're talking about like being able to get from point A to point B, whether it is, being able to go pick up your kids from school or get to church or go to work. But because Virginia is specifically, houses many of our national security assets, which I appreciate you bringing up, it's also a national security issue for us. To be able to get, a safe way to get out of the naval area where we are seeing resiliency being a serious challenge with the flooding on our eastern portion of the Commonwealth, and up here in Northern Virginia where some of our bridges are reaching the end of their useful life, and there will be no way to get over the bridge at some point. It's very, very serious.
Thanks. And Amber, I'll pose the same question to you. What would you say to folks who maybe aren't working on this on a daily basis, but how would you like them to approach the reauthorization process?
Well, my response is going to sound redundant, I think, to many of the other things that we've heard, but it's important to just continue to remember that transportation connects people to where they want to go. And it's for a range of activities, including access to healthcare, to making sure that they can get food within their own community. It really is the way, it's the thread that weaves our communities together throughout our state, throughout the country, and all those communities have different needs, and they need different options that are reliable and affordable for them to move around.
Thanks. I promise, Amber, you're not always going to get to go last. We'll mix it up. It's no fun to always go first or always go last. We have a question in the back. I saw a hand up earlier, and if you have other questions, I'll try to catch me and make sure you get a chance.
Yes, hi. Thank you. So, less than 3 years ago, HR 3685 passed for the Transportation Infrastructure and Jobs Act. Did that benefit you in your states? And specifically, I know that it benefited Governor Newsom in California, and I know some other examples, but did it benefit you in any of the projects that you're still trying to implement? And is any carryover of resources from that?
Great, thanks. IIJA came up in a bunch of presentations. Would anyone like to take a stab to elaborate a little bit more on that?
On the benefit?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Amber.
Sure. I do think there were benefits to IIJA. In a lot of ways, we had some work that we had been doing as a state around some of the program areas specifically, and I'll focus on sustainability. The senator may be able to talk more broadly. But we had some strategies outlined and some goals identified. I think what the funding helped us do was really take more action in terms of identifying what it looks like in terms of projects and project development. And there's still work for us to do in terms of how to better integrate that work, especially as it pertains to resilience and carbon reduction or providing travel options for people throughout the state. But it did provide us a way to have a conversation about addressing our community needs in a more holistic and balanced way.
Great, thanks. Other comments?
Yeah, I would say similarly, if you saw my slides, and I'm happy to share them with you later, but I went line by line with the impact that the different pots of money provided for our Commonwealth, and it was essential. Again, it makes up 17.4% of our entire transportation budget, which is a significant amount of money. And we wouldn't have been able to do a lot of the planning and the implementation of some of the projects without that funding. It was essential.
Thanks. Go ahead, Benito.
I'll jump in from a high-level perspective. Some benefits that came from IJA. More local communities had a chance to participate. Usually a lot of the funding formula goes straight to the states and eventually goes to the localities, but this was a chance to directly send monies to localities to actually tackle the things that they're dealing with on the ground, on the spot. There was also more money for passenger rail. Federal Railroad Administration historically has been basically a safety organization. And this time, because of IJA, they became also investing in our system, passenger and freight. Granted, within those two examples, one of the challenges was also the lack of capacity. That's going to be necessary. You can throw a lot of money at it, but if the capacity is not there to implement it, it's not going to be used effectively. So, there's a need to build up capacities like at FRA, at our localities, so they can leverage those further. But I also want to make sure that, for everyone in the room, be mindful. There's been some benefits with IJA, but at the end of the day, some of the outcomes are still quite negative, and I would say counterweight the benefits that are coming from IJA. We're still year after year seeing increase in roadway deaths. We're still seeing increases in emissions. Our state of repair of our, we talked about investing in the state of repair, and yet we see more roadways and bridges still falling into disrepair. So,
Yeah, one of the programs I was thinking about with the electric buses came from the infrastructure bill. We have a lot of resources about that as well, kind of getting at decarbonization, but also moving kids around in a safe way. I'm looking for other questions, and while we have one up here in the front. Okay, I'll save mine because I have a really good online question, so we'll get to that one next. It's making its way.
Question's better than feel free to use it.
I'll judge.
Benito actually started answering this, but I don't think, which is sort of name a couple things that you want to keep, and maybe a couple things you want to change.
Great, thanks. That can be a free-for-all. Shruti, you didn't comment on the last question, but if you have anything you'd like to say, we're welcome to go first.
Sure. So I think IIJA was like a good starting point for a number of things. One, building climate and equity into a surface transportation bill in the way that it did, I think was something that a lot of us were excited to see. I think we were also really excited to see money being put in a real way towards technical assistance for communities who had struggled in the past to sort of access federal dollars for transportation. And so programs like Thriving Communities really helped them sort of like navigate the landscape in a way that made those dollars a lot more accessible. In terms of things that we would have loved to have seen changed, I think there was just not enough, in many cases for us, there weren't enough teeth to certain programs. So when we were talking about the flexibilities, for instance, states could really sort of decide how they wanted to flex that money in a way that really wasn't in line with the goals and the priorities of the program that the money originally came from. So I think whatever happens next, we're more interested in seeing sort of some of those guardrails implemented in a way so that the money is being directed to things that are actually going to make people's lives easier, reduce emissions, and create safe transportation systems. The other thing that I think was an issue for us, we spent a lot of time working on something pretty esoteric, the greenhouse gas performance measure that was based at FHWA as part of the National Highway Performance Program that's required states to sort of set targets and then track how they were doing on emissions reduction, greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And that was implemented, but then got stayed in the courts. And quite frankly, to us, like data transparency is going to be hugely important in trying to understand sort of the benefits of any big law like this. And that was a first step to doing that on climate. And I feel like for the next round, making sure that we have access to data, we understand how states are spending money is going to be hugely important to determining the success of the program.
Okay. Anything else from the panel?
I would just say that, as has been discussed, right? Money is tight in our budgets. Holding the line and not reducing it, if at all possible, I would just make that plea. We have so many more needs than we have funding for. I'll use our metro system, which is not only in Virginia, but it's in Washington and it's in Maryland. And we are our metro system is the only major metro system in the country that does not have a dedicated funding source. That seems ridiculous to me, and I would love to see a federal contribution towards just the operations and the making sure that it's solvent.
Go ahead, please.
Just to build on Shruti's response, I think one of the things I'd like to see more is accountability of the program. One thing is also accountability to the states. Each state and region is required to produce a transportation improvement program that lists all the investments that they plan to do and how they're going to pay for it and when they're going to deliver. But if you were to compare Virginia to Minnesota, they're not speaking the same language. So at the end of the day, when you expect that information to roll up to you all, is see what are we spending it on. You're left in the U.S. DOT is left in a situation to tell you, like, the states are spending the money. We just can tell you exactly what are they spending it on, and what is the performance outcomes coming from said investment. So getting some semblance of accountability and standardization on that reporting will also help to drive some of the performance-driven outcomes of the program. And the last thing I'll point out for the sake of time is unlocking some of the policies in the program that may be blocking true state flexibility. And I say that from the perspective there might be some tipping the scales in the program that might teeter towards the car. And we need to allow a true opportunity for the states to make their own determination. You know, there are some states that might be transit first. We need to allow them to be transit first. I'll highlight a territorial example, actually. The Territorial Highway Program is exclusively auto-dominated. There is no room for biking, walking, transit in that program, none. So the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, they're in a situation that their funding, which they only get about a little less than half of what Washington, D.C. gets for 5 times the population, is specifically focused to build only roads. There's no space for complete streets, no space for transit. And there's examples like that across the entire program that may hinder Virginia, Minnesota, and even Puerto Rico.
Great, thanks. All right, well, I'm gonna look for a question. Oh, we do have one. And then I'm gonna use this one as the last lightning round. So please go ahead, thank you.
Thanks so much for speaking with us. I was wondering if any of the panelists had suggestions on how to make pots of funding like the Highway Trust Fund more solvent. I know that the most common idea that's been floating around is an EV tax, but there must be other ways. So I was wondering if anybody had any suggestions.
Great question. Who would like that one? Oh,
So
Jennifer, go ahead.
We've implemented a miles used pilot program. I think we're one of the very few in the state, in the country, where you can voluntarily sign up, and instead of the gas tax that we know as our efficiency increases is not bringing in the revenues that we used to, you are looked at your miles traveled, and we're seeing if that might be a reasonable and sustainable process instead.
Great, thanks. Other comments?
I can take it. One of the easiest ways would just be to peg the gas tax to inflation. That would, I mean, the gas tax hasn't been raised in, however many years, and that would be the simplest, maybe not the most politically viable solution, but the simplest way to start generating the money that the Highway Trust Fund needs.
And I'm going to be the unpopular answer here. If we're getting negative outcomes, why are we asking for more money? We need to live within our means and rethink the structure of the program before we ask for more money. So, yeah.
Amber, do you have any comments you'd like to? Okay, great. All right, so this is a cool question, and it might be an interesting place to stop because we're getting pretty close to time. So this question points out that the last time we had a transportation bill, it became an infrastructure bill, and it picked up a lot of things that are not considered surface transportation. And so the question is, what is the outlook this year for a transportation bill to accept add-ons of other types of infrastructure? That makes me wonder, like, any thoughts about what the outlook is? If we start working on a surface transportation bill in the next year to 2 years, does anyone want to take a stab at what the odds might be that maybe it evolves a little bit and maybe grows an extra appendage, or maybe, has a fifth wheel that maybe not transportation? Any thoughts about what that process might look like?
I'll stir the pot.
Yes, please stir.
I'll stir the pot. It was quite innovative to, think outside the box, to think about the true ecosystem of, infrastructure. When we talk about electric vehicles, you also need to think about the electric grid and ensuring that there's the appropriate investments to support that. And love to see more of that, inclusive of the appropriate incentives to support housing and land use innovation and investments to maximize the true transportation investments. However, as we've already alluded to, the trust fund is not solvent. The question earlier was talking about how we're going to pay for it. So that's going to be the big question that has to be answered here first. Because actually, since Safety Lou, Congress has pulled $650 billion out of the general trust fund, and similarly for this most recent reauthorization was a sizable sum. So that's going to be the first question, is first figuring out the revenue question before we can get into what is comprised of it. But transportation is not in a vacuum, and transportation does impact our housing, impacts land use, impacts health, and this is the opportunity to think of it as a holistic system.
Great, thank you. Shruti, I'll give you an opportunity to comment, but you don't have to, because you can say anything else you want because we're running out of time. So you can answer the question, or you can just share a last word, and then we'll hear from Jennifer, and we'll give Amber the last word today.
Okay. I think mine will be a combination of the question
Fair
and
enough.
some other thoughts. I think that a lot of what is going to happen will depend on whether we can get any sort of agreement in the House and the Senate at the end of the day. We are at a point where IIJA funding ends in FY26. We have enough funding to go through FY28. So in some senses, we may see extensions rather than like a real negotiation process for a new bill altogether. All that's up in the air. That will, I think, that will determine whether or not we get these extra appendages. Just in terms of closing points, I just want to reiterate that we need to be building transportation systems that work for people, and that don't favor the car just because it has favored the car in the past. And so I think I think we're all aligned in making sure that transportation funding needs to support that idea, and hopefully the next surface transportation bill will get us a little bit closer to that.
Thanks. Jennifer, again, same thing to you. You can answer the question or you can not. But whatever you'd like to say is in terms of last words, please go ahead.
Certainly. So, I mean, as has been said, transportation does not exist in a vacuum. Our economy depends on it. And one thing that Benito talked about was our electrical grid, right? If we are going to electrify our transportation system, we got to make sure that that is solid. But we also need to make certain that our broadband infrastructure is in place, which we've done a whole lot of work in Virginia, so that, as technology increases, as people have more options around perhaps even working from home and not having to be out, moving every single day, those are all integral parts of this conversation, I believe, and hope that would be taken into consideration as well.
Thanks. And Amber, you traveled the furthest to get here. You get the last word on our panel today. These are your minutes, so
Yeah.
I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Well, I think the folks on the panel have touched on some of these, but some of the state conversations that we're having, in addition to the transportation system, is how it is impacted and is affected by other sectors, and how much the transportation sector even influences those other sectors. So we're looking at what the intersection of land use is, and how do we as a state DOT consider land use, and in particular, what does that mean for our own ability to maintain our transportation system and infrastructure, which is something that I think many states are wrestling with.
Mm-hmm.
And as we start to think through our utilities and our grid, we've also been looking at and exploring how our public rights of ways can be used for transmission of energy as a source to help us transition to a more sustainable grid. In terms of things to look for in the next reauthorization, the folks have already shared and said some of this. It really is about the people, and we've heard from people throughout our state that they want to be able to have options that are convenient and affordable for them to move around. And in terms of the reauthorization, I think that does result in a level of flexibility, making sure that states have flexibility to address what our goals are, and meeting our needs overall as a system. And also, one of the challenges that we had with this particular bill was that there wasn't it was challenging to use some of the resources for capacity, and making sure that we had staffing to help hold up some of this to accomplish the goals that may have been outlined within those particular formula programs. So I think it's important to consider how states are going to continue to administer transportation as a whole and serve people.
Great. Well, that was a really good series of answers. And just to kind of summarize for the person in our online audience who asked the question, it sounds like the consensus answer is it depends. That there are significant constraints. Some of them are green rectangles. Others maybe are political constraints. that it's a good idea theoretically to be more holistic, to make investments in one part of our infrastructure and part of our in another. But ultimately, it's going to boil down to whether implementation can be done flexibly, whether we can have accountability built in, and whether we can also ensure that states and local governments have the capacity to actually do the stuff on the timeline that's being asked of them. So that's just my summary of what I heard, but that was great. Our panelists deserve a round of applause. Benito, Shruti, Jennifer, and Amber, thank you so much for being here today. Really great series of presentations, and if you want to go back and rewatch any of this, everything will be, the recording will be on our website, www.eesi.org. Presentation materials, other resources, things like that as well, and eventually summary notes. So thank you so much for a great session. Great way to wrap up Congressional Climate Camp. I'd also like to say thanks again to Representative Tonko and his great staff for helping us with the room today. Joined today by my great colleagues. We have Dan O, we have Amory, we have Allison, we have Anna, we have Molly, we have Nicole, and we have Hannah. Thanks for all of the work that you put into making today a big success and Climate Camp generally. We also have 3 awesome interns, Raneem, Hadley, and Whitney. Thanks for all of your contributions as well. And of course, our videographer somewhere in the back. Oh, I see a hand. Troy, who helps bring this to our robust online audience. So this was the 4th of 4 Congressional Climate Camps, but if you want to learn about climate modeling, if you want to learn about drivers of climate change, if you want to learn about the budget or appropriations, that seems to be a thing that people might be interested in these days, reconciliation, if you want to learn about clean jobs, clean manufacturing jobs. Those are all things that we covered in other installments of Congressional Climate Camp. And we also have other great briefings. We're doing a series on river community resilience, resilient and healthy rivers. We have the Business Council for Sustainable Energy and the Sustainable Energy in America Factbook coming up. We've got lots and lots of great stuff. If you want to keep up with all of that, subscribe to Climate Change Solutions. It's our bi-weekly newsletter. It's the great way. And if this series of presentations whetted your appetite for bipartisan action on sustainability and big legislative packages, we have a lot of stuff around the Farm Bill too, which is another one of those will they, won't they's in the world of big authorization. So if you're finding yourself in a position where you need to get up on agriculture issues very quickly, we have a briefing series that you can watch. We have lots of side-by-side resources. We have hearing trackers, lots of articles about really cool agriculture topics as well. And that's, again, entirely available at www.eesi.org. There's the link to the survey again. If you're so moved, we'd really appreciate it if you took a moment or two to let us know what you thought. If you're in our online audience today, if you had any issues with the live cast, or if there are any sound issues, or if you have ideas for future briefings, this would be a great way to let us know. We read every response. Those of us who are wearing our little lapel pins, we're going to hang out for a few minutes. If you'd like to network for a moment, our panelists will be around for a minute or two more. Thank you so much to everyone for being with us today. And we'll see you back in a couple weeks on April 1st. Thanks so much, everybody.